Welcome to the Nameless.
No one knew who added the new one. I stood at the edge of the clearing, my boots sinking into the damp ground, staring at the fresh stone that hadn't been there the year before. It sat perfectly in line with the others, the same height, the same pale color, like it had always belonged. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, just that low, empty silence you get when something is wrong, but you can't explain why. I didn't touch the stone. I didn't step inside the circle. I just stood there, trying to remember how many there used to be, and realizing I couldn't anymore. I grew up in a small town that most people passed through without noticing. One main road, a gas station that closed too early, and a stretch of woods behind the old quarry where kids went to drink and tell stories they pretended not to believe. I'd lived there my whole life. After high school, I stayed, picked up work doing land surveys and boundary checks for property disputes.
It wasn't exciting, but it paid, and I liked being outdoors. I knew the woods better than most people. I knew where the ground stayed wet even in summer, which paths deer preferred, which clearings were old logging scars, and which ones felt older than that. The circle of stones was something everyone knew about, but nobody talked about much. It was back past the quarry, about a mile off the nearest trail. 12 stones, arranged in a wide ring. Each one stood about waist high, sunk deep into the ground. When I was a kid, people said it was an art project, or something left behind by surveyors decades ago. Others said it marked an old meeting place for a group that didn't exist anymore. It was always brushed off as a curiosity. You could visit it. People did sometimes. Nothing ever happened there. That was the story anyway. The first time I noticed the change was during a job in early fall. I was checking property markers near the tree line, not far from the quarry. I had time to kill, so I cut through the woods toward the circle. I hadn't been there in a couple of years. When I reached the clearing, something felt off immediately. I stood there, counting the stones without really meaning to. 13. I counted again. Still 13. I remember laughing to myself, thinking I just never paid close attention before. Memory plays tricks like that. Still, I took a photo with my phone, more out of habit than concern. The new stone looked cleaner than the others, less weathered, no moss. It hadn't cracked like some of the older ones. It stood between two stones I was sure had been side by side before. I left not long after, feeling unsettled but telling myself it was nothing. A few weeks later, a guy named Mark went missing. He wasn't a close friend, but everyone knew him. He ran the bait shop near the river. He went out for a walk one evening and didn't come back. Search teams went through the woods, the riverbanks, everywhere.
They didn't find anything. No signs of a struggle, no belongings. Just gone. After a while, people stopped talking about him out loud, the way they always did. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Over the next year, 2 more people disappeared. Different ages, different routines, no connection anyone could prove. Each time, the searches came up empty. Each time, the town got quieter. Less foot traffic on trails, fewer kids wandering the woods. I kept doing my job, but I found myself avoiding the quarry area without really admitting why. The following fall, I had another job nearby. I told myself I wouldn't go back to the circle. I didn't need to. Still, my feet took me there like they'd already decided. The clearing looked the same at first glance. Same trees, same patchy grass, same smell of damp leaves. I started counting before I even reached the edge. 14. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the walk.
The newest stone stood out the same way the last one had. Too clean, too precise. I walked a perimeter, not stepping inside, just circling slowly. There were faint marks in the dirt between some of the stones. Not footprints exactly, more like scuffs, as if something heavy had been dragged then lifted. I left quickly that time. I didn't take a photo. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. I kept thinking there had to be a simple explanation. Someone adding stones as a prank, a local tradition I didn't know about. The problem was that no one ever claimed responsibility, and no one ever seemed surprised. That winter, I started asking careful questions. Not directly, just comments here and there. Most people shrugged it off. A few got uncomfortable fast. One older man at the hardware store told me I was misremembering, that the circle had always been that way. When I mentioned the missing people, he changed the subject so abruptly it felt rehearsed. I began doing my own walks, sticking to daylight, carrying my phone and a small recorder. I wanted proof, something solid. I noticed patterns I hadn't before. Scraps of twine in the brush. A repeated path worn into the ground leading toward the clearing from different directions. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make me feel watched, even when I was alone. One afternoon, I found a backpack hanging from a low branch near the quarry. It was old and sun-faded. Inside were empty water bottles, a notebook with blank pages, and a cheap flashlight that didn't work. No name, no phone. I reported it. It didn't lead anywhere. By the next fall, I was almost afraid to go back. Almost. When I finally did, I already knew what I'd find. 15 stones. The circle felt tighter somehow, even though it hadn't changed size. The air inside it looked different, like heat rising off pavement, even though it was cold. I stood at the edge for a long time, listening. That was when I noticed the sound. A low hum, barely audible, coming from somewhere beneath the ground. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't steady. It pulsed, slowly, like breathing. I thought about stepping inside. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe. Or that strange urge you get when something feels unfinished. I didn't. Instead, I noticed something else. The stones weren't just clean. They were aligned. Each one turned slightly inward, like they were meant to be seen from the center. I left, shaking, and decided I needed help. I went to the county office and asked about land records around the quarry. The clerk pulled old maps, yellowed and brittle. The clearing wasn't marked on any of them. What was marked, faintly, was a note written in the margin of one map from decades ago. Not a label, just a number, crossed out and written again, over and over. I couldn't stop thinking about that. That winter, another person disappeared, a woman who liked to hike alone. I attended the town meeting where they talked about safety measures. Nobody mentioned the woods behind the quarry. Nobody mentioned the circle. I felt like I was losing my grip on what was real and what wasn't. The breaking point came in early spring. I was out near the clearing again, not by choice this time. A property line had shifted, and I needed to confirm markers. As I worked, I heard voices, low, calm, coming from the direction of the circle. I crouched behind a fallen log and listened. There were maybe 6 or 7 people. They weren't chanting, they weren't arguing. They spoke quietly, like they were discussing something practical. I couldn't make out words, just tones. After a while, they stopped. I heard the sound of stones scraping against earth, then silence. I waited a long time before moving. When I finally reached the clearing, the circle was empty. 16 stones. I knew then that it wasn't random. It wasn't a prank. It was deliberate, controlled. I also knew I wasn't supposed to be there. I felt that as clearly as anything I'd ever known. I went home and packed a bag. I told myself I'd leave town for a while, clear my head. That night I dreamed of the circle.
not standing in it, but lying down, looking up at the stones leaning inward, blocking out the sky one by one. In the morning, there was dirt on my boots. I never found proof, not the kind that mattered. No photos that couldn't be explained away, no recordings that didn't come out as static. The stones kept increasing, once a year like clockwork. The missing people stopped being talked about entirely. I moved away that summer. Different state, different job. I avoided thinking about the woods, the quarry, the circle. It almost worked. Last week I got a message from someone I barely remembered. A photo attachment. No text. Just an image of a clearing I knew too well. 17 stones. No one knows who adds the new one.
I don't think that's the right question anymore. I think the real question is, why there's always room for one more.